Well, the winter meetings are officially over, and the New York Mets were very active adding pitching. They got Justin Verlander, they got Jose Quintana, and at the end, they make a trade to bolster their bullpen, acquiring Brooks Raley from the Tampa Bay Rays. Was this a good deal? Also, Jake Mangum ends up getting traded. I don't love that. We'll discuss the Mets prospect going to the Marlins and just where things stand with this Mets team as we conclude what was a very pivotal couple of days of the offseason.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, the Mets make a trade today to bolster their bullpen by acquiring Brooks Raley from the Tampa Bay Rays in exchange for Keyshawn Askew, a Mets prospect who we'll discuss in a little bit here. I'm not really happy about the return that the Rays got here, but let's focus on the positive, and that is Brooks Raley coming back to the Mets. Now, this is a guy that is a little bit of a journeyman in the sense that it took him a long time to establish himself, and really, he's coming off kind of his only good year, but the numbers are a little bit deceiving if you just go strictly on ERA. So early in his career with the Cubs, not good. 2012-2013 leaves the States, goes to the KBO as a starting pitcher, finds some success, comes back in 2020 with the Reds as a reliever, doesn't find success, 4 innings pitched, 4 earned runs, gets dropped by them, ends up in Houston, pitched to a 3.94 ERA in 16 innings with 21 strikeouts and a 0.75 whip. So a lot of things were showing you there. All right, this guy's got some promise. 2021 rolls around. 4.78 ERA for Brooks Raley, 49 innings pitched. Ends up with 65 strikeouts, though the whip was pretty good at 1.20. It could have been better, but overall, when you look at his numbers, they're deceiving because advanced metrics love him. His left on base percentage was less than 60%. That means he was stranding, about half of the runners that were on, and that's not going to lead to a lot of success, and that's going to lead to a bloated ERA, as we saw. But the Rays saw everything he did in Houston as a really smart organization, said, you know what, 2-year deal, club option, we're bringing him in. And he pitched great this year, 2.68 ERA, had 6 saves, 22 holds, 53 and 2/3 innings pitched, 61 strikeouts, a 0.97 whip. You love all of those stats, but you really go to his baseball savant, and this is one of these guys that has nasty stuff, and that's what all of the data is telling us. You look at average exit velocity in the top 15% of the league, hard hit percentage, 98th percentile, top 3% of the league. He does a great job avoiding that hard contact, does a really good job of missing barrels. In the 99th percentile in barrel percentage. Expected slugging, 94th percentile. Expected ERA, 88th percentile. Whatever, we get it. The guy's great. The only bubble on his baseball savant page that's not red is his fastball velocity and his extension. Because he doesn't throw hard, and despite being 6'3", doesn't really have great extension on the mound. But it doesn't matter because he's a guy that doesn't even really throw a fastball. I mean, he is a slider pitcher. That's what he has. He has a sweeping slider, and that's the bread and butter that he leads on. He throws it about 40% of the time. This year was 38.2%. Has a sinker, a changeup, and a cutter. Mixes all of those in about 20% of the time. The sinker, 22.5, so a little bit more. But that's really his 4-pitch mix. He's had data pick up a fastball and 1 curveball this year. A former starter that certainly has it in his arsenal. The curveball is a pitch he actually abandoned with the Rays. He threw it in 2021, 12.4 or 12.8% of the time. So he abandoned that. It's basically a 4-pitch mix, and the slider is the bread and butter. Batters hit 177 against it, 333 slugging, but the expected slugging was 266. Put away batters 26.7% of the time when he used it, 35% whiff rate. The year prior, the whiff rate on the slider was 48.8%. That is the pitch that the Mets are buying into here. It breaks horizontally 7.8 inches more than your average slider. Again, sweeping is the only verb that can really describe it. I mean, that pitch just goes from one side of the plate to the other. 18.5 inches of horizontal movement on that slider, and that's why the Mets are getting him. And look, he can slot right into the back end of your bullpen. He is the left-handed reliever that the Mets wanted to get all of last year and never quite found. So I love it in one sense. I love the idea of Brooks Raley in the Mets bullpen. Don't love the fact that you didn't just wait to see if you can get Andrew Chafin, who has a longer track record of success, is a left-handed reliever, and it's not like Brooks Raley is making no money. I mean, he's making $4.5 million, and he has a club option for $6.5 million with a $1.25 million buyout. So you're looking at $5.75 million of guaranteed money. How much more would it cost to get Andrew Chafin? Does he get $8 million? What did Chafin make this year? Let me see. I honestly do not know. So he had signed a 2-year, $13 million contract. So 6.5. No, wait. Yeah, 6.5. And he was good this year, so maybe gets a little bit of a raise, but what, 8 is maybe where you're looking at most here? I just don't love it in that sense, especially because you give up Keyshawn Askew. And this is a pitching prospect who, the Mets drafted in the 10th round in 2021. He is 22 years old. He'll turn 23 in January. Comes from Clemson. Has had great success in the minors so far. 2.27 ERA in 75 and a third innings pitched. This year, 2.44 ERA in 66 and a third. He's striking out 12.7 batters per nine in his career. With the Mets, 12.5 this past season. The walk rate's not even crazy. We see some of these Mets minor league relief pitchers that are striking out the world, but they're walking the world too with walk rates at 6, 7 batters per nine. He's a 3.8, which you'd want him to get down, but I mean, he goes to the Rays, and you just know in 2024 this guy's going to be filthy as all can be. He could have been cost-controlled left-handed reliever the Mets had. Now, granted, if you remember my take on Colin Holderman getting traded for Daniel Vogelbach, I'm never going to get super upset about a, relief pitcher getting a major league piece. If it's a one prospect who's profiling as a reliever, there's only so many they're going to turn into Edwin Diaz. So we don't know if Keyshawn Askew is going to get there, and I really don't think Colin Holderman will either. With that said, when free agency is still out there, like this is a move that I like more if free agency has come to pass and you're at the end of the offseason, you make the trade. I like Raley in the bullpen. I just wonder if they could have done better holding on to this prospect who could have been a nice piece in 2024, 2025. Just signed a guy in free agency. Again, it's not even like Brooks Raley is a pre-arbitration guy with control that you traded for that's making nothing this year. I mean, he's making money. So it is what it is. I think that it's going to be good for the 2023 club, but I'm going to be very curious what Askew's career is going to look like in a few years. So that's just one of those what-ifs that we'll find out in the future. But another one is that Jake Mangum is going to the Marlins, where good for him. He probably has a chance to actually play. We'll discuss that in just a minute. First, though, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from football to basketball to soccer and esports. They've got it all at BetOnline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. BetOnline is always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, a couple of other moves that happened at the end of the winter meetings. We'll start with Jake Mangum. He ends up as the player to be named later in the trade that brought Eliezer Hernandez and was it Jeff Brigham to the Mets? Confirm that I'm right on that. Yes, Jeff Brigham. I knew it was Brigham. I was not positive if his first name was Jeff. Look, I love Jake Mangum as a prospect. Now, do I stop very far short of any Mets fans saying, how can you lose Mangum when you don't have Nimmo locked up? Absolutely. Jake Mangum, he's probably a fourth outfielder. Okay? He's 27 years old. That doesn't necessarily make him a prospect. You know, he would have had a hard time making this team this year. I think that he really could have been the fourth outfielder for them. But that wasn't guaranteed. And for his career, awesome. Go to Miami. You can start in center field probably. I mean, I was talking to Aram Layton, who is, a big prospect guy who is a huge Marlins fan as well, growing up down here in South Florida where I live too. And he looked at Jake Mangum as, yes, same thing as me, a fourth outfielder, but he's thrilled about this because they've had this black hole defensively in center field, and Mangum can fill that. And while he's not the greatest hitter in the world, a 118 WRC plus and double in AAA this year is pretty solid. I think I saw that of the Mets' main minor league prospects, that was like the 9th best WRC plus in their system. So he was able to hit. He hit all through college. He's never going to tap into a ton of power, but he's starting to a little bit more. And, he's got some speed. So, yeah, could this guy be someone that is just one of those grinders who plays his ass off, honestly? I mean, you watch him play. He plays so hard. He's a good character guy, a good leader. I mean, you see it. And I remember when I was in AA this year, when I went and saw a game in Binghamton, like you could see that he was the guy when they're running in and it's whatever that day, it might have been like a Thursday and it's a day game and you're playing minor league baseball and guys maybe are struggling to get up. Who's like, let's go, let's get runs. Let's, the rah-rah stuff that I remember from when I played baseball. You always had that one guy that's a little bit more into it than everyone else. That's Jake Mangum. So I think he has a chance to outperform expectations. So I don't love that he ends up moving in this trade to get depth. I mean, Brigham, I guess I forgot about him. He's another arm in the Mets bullpen. And look, they had to build a bullpen from scratch. So you got to do what you got to do. They got Diaz, they got Raley, they got Brigham, they got Drew Smith. They're starting to piece together an MLB pen. And, they have a lot of guys they brought in on minor league deals that can factor in as well. But I definitely feel worse about Mangum, I think, leaving than Askew. But I really don't love either of these guys leaving the organization today. To get pitching help that ultimately you would have hoped you could have added just simply through free agency. But maybe the Mets just are unaware how that market's going to transpire. And they just can't afford to wait it out. Maybe that's where we're at. So that's the big moves. They did add Zach Green in the Rule 5 draft, taking the 26-year-old from the Yankees farm system. As you may know, the Rule 5 draft means they now need to keep Green on their MLB roster for the season to retain control of him. He pitched to a 3.42 ERA in AAA last year in 68 and third and did strike out 12.9 batters per 9. The Yankees bullpen a lot more full. That's why they didn't protect him from the Rule 5 draft. The Mets swoop in and grab him, an 8th round pick in 2019. He is another guy where it's big time slider that you're looking at here. A lot of strikeouts. It was 96 Ks in 68 and a third innings pitched. So it's a good option. So now if you're sort of piecing together your pen, I mean, Zach Green is a part of it for now as a Rule 5 selection. You're looking at maybe 5 relievers in place. You can kind of see where the Mets are going here with a bunch of minor league signings that can factor into the mix. We discussed yesterday, Tommy Hunter, Sean Reed-Foley coming back into the Foley. That's a horrible pun, I'm sorry. But there's arms now, right? You're starting to get depth, and that's what I think the Mets are really focused on. So hats off to them. They're doing a nice job. I still think Adam Ottavino, I wish Andrew Chafin, maybe now you already got your lefty. Who knows if you get another. The Mets got to add a couple of arms here. Trevor May, I think, wants to be back. So I would circle and bring him back after a down year. We can get him at maybe a lower price tag. Who knows? Maybe throw some incentives in there for a guy that has a pedigree of being a late inning reliever. But the Mets got to add still, I think, 2 or 3 arms, like MLB arms, to feel comfortable going into spring. They're on the right track, though. Now, with all of this said, we can now get a clear picture of the remaining needs after the winter meetings, and we also have some reports that are left here about the guys the Mets are still interested in. There's some starters that they're still in on beyond just Kodai Senga. So I'll go through those guys and we'll really just look at where the roster's at after all this movement. I'll get to that in a minute. First, though, another word from our sponsors. So the New York Mets are still squarely in the market for Kodai Senga, and I think that's probably their number one option left to address their rotation, but it seems like they want another starter, and this is just a completely different philosophy than what we saw under the Wilpons or really any team around baseball. And I was just watching on YouTube a little clip from MLB Network where it was Sean Casey, Mark DeRosa, and Greg Amsinger. And they were talking about the Mets, and they called them the third best team in this division. And when asked what the Mets could do to be a top two team, both DeRosa and Casey said, get another starter. I guess DeRosa did mention Nimmo, which I do agree with. But yeah, Sean Casey said, get Carlos Rodon. It's like the Mets make rotation ads, and we're expected to look at this Mets rotation and think that they need to have like 7 good starters, where other teams can have 4 and they're the second best team in this division. And I'm talking squarely about the Phillies. Like, do we forget that the Phillies snuck into the playoffs? I know they were great in the postseason and they changed a lot of people's minds about them. But how many times do we see the wild card one-year wonder come out of the woodwork the next year and do it again? Did the Nationals do it in 2020? I mean, granted, it was 2020, but what has happened to that franchise since then? 2020, 2021, whatever. They've blown it up, and they won the World Series. I just stop short of anointing the Phillies. I know they got Trey Turner. That's a fantastic addition. Bryce Harper might not play until June. And beyond their front 4, what do they have in that rotation as far as depth that's better that the Mets had to add Rodon to be on the Phillies level? Let's just go pitcher by pitcher. Top 2, Verlander, Scherzer, Nola, Wheeler. Which duo are you taking next year? Now, if you want to say the Phillies, by all means, I'll take the track record of Verlander and Scherzer. Also knowing that, man, Wheeler seemed to be breaking down a little bit in the playoffs at the end. So and really throughout the year. Nola's got a lot of mileage on that arm, and they just pitched a ton of innings. How are they going to hold up? Suarez over Quintana. Phillies got you for sure. Carrasco, Taijuan Walker. Is Taijuan Walker that good? I kind of like David Peterson more than Taijuan Walker moving forward. And maybe I'm just a David Peterson homer at this point, but I just don't understand it. So I've kind of lost my track in my initial point because I just watched that video before recording, and it still kind of has me a little bit heated. The disrespect from a 101-win team. The regular season's a much larger, accurate sample set of what a team is than the playoffs, okay? And at this point, the only thing the Mets have lost is basically Brandon Nimmo. And they have to build back their bullpen. But it's the same team at this point that won all those games. Now, my initial point. In the past, if the Mets had a rotation as good as the one they have right now, you'd be done. And that's kind of where I was when I recorded the Quintana episode today. I was like, look, if they're set with this, I'm happy. And I felt the same way last year when I was looking at a rotation that was Jacob deGrom, Max Scherzer, Carlos Carrasco, David Peterson, Taijuan Walker, Tyler Miguel. I think they got 6 starters. They're good. Right now, the Mets have Scherzer, Verlander, Quintana, Carrasco, Peterson, Miguel in the same spot. Yet, just like last year when they got Bassett, they still want a little more. So, Chris Bassett, still apparently in the cards. We'll see what happens. Kodai Senga in the mix. They're also in on Trevor Williams. Does Trevor Williams want to go somewhere else to get a real chance to start? Although the Mets say, hey, you might have a shot to start in our rotation, which I think is a little disingenuous because I just can't imagine him falling above even McGill in the pecking order. Maybe over McGill. Best case scenario, if they give him some inkling he could start, he'd maybe be the 6th starter in the current rotation. But that's if they don't add anyone else. So I don't know if that's the case, but if he's comfortable coming back in the same exact role he had this year, an amazing signing for the Mets, and I would pay even a little bit more to get him back because I think that fits really, really nicely. He just showed you he can do it, so go out and do it again. They're also interested in Ross Stripling. So, Stripling is a guy that had a really nice year in Toronto. He could be another quality starter for you. And for the Blue Jays, he ended up being, their number 3 by the end of the year behind Gausman and Alek Manoah. So there's some upside with Ross Stripling. Ultimately, I think that the need to get a guy that you want to hand the ball to in the postseason is going to lead the road back to Senga, and I still think that that's maybe the most likely splash left for this Mets team. But it's either Senga or Nimmo, and the only reason why I think Senga's more likely is because Nimmo's market is just getting out of control, and the Mets aren't speaking with confidence about retaining him. I mean, Buck Showalter all but spoke in the past tense in relation to Nimmo. It didn't seem like Billy Eppler was too confident about it either when he was asked. So I'm just getting my mind wrapped around, as I have the entire offseason, if you've been listening, to a future without Nimmo in the Mets outfield. And now you lose some depth with Mangum. Not connecting the two that Mangum was going to start, but more just saying that overall you're going to have to address this outfield because there's no depth in the minor leagues now. I mean, you got Khalil Lee, and if they want to make Ronnie Mauricio an outfielder this season, which would make sense to me with Brett Beatty potentially clogging up third, with McNeil and Lindor at the middle, with Alonso at first, there might not be any room for Mauricio in the infield. So if you think that he's going to stay with your club and you're not going to trade him, move him off shortstop. If the plan is to trade him, then maybe you keep him at short for another season, let him put up some gaudy numbers and try to flip him at the deadline. So I think we'll understand how the Mets value Mauricio's bat with where they put him defensively to start this season. If they really value him and think he's going to be a good major leaguer, I think he'll be in the outfield, and that might solve some of these issues by the end of the season. I mean, the way this guy's playing in the Winter League, you really can't rule him out to surprise us and find his way in an MLB roster next season. So that's where they're at with their depth. They got to go out and add a legitimate starting level outfielder, whether that be in trade, whether it be re-signing Nimmo, or finding something in free agency. And there's just not much there. And then you probably got to try to acquire a defensive outfielder. And usually you can get those guys on minor league deals. And so maybe the Mets will be fine with the Travis Jankowskis of the world. But I just think if you end up in a place where you're relying on Starling Marte in center field, and whether it's a guy like Michael Conforto in right field, or if you're even getting crazier and you're trying to start a Michael Brantley in the outfield, there's just a bigger need to make sure that fourth outfielder can be a starter if one of those guys goes down. The other name I keep on forgetting is Andrew Benintendi. He'd be a nice fit for the Mets. He really would be. He's like a Brandon Nimmo light. So not quite someone I'd put in center. Don't really love him in right either, but maybe you would put him in center and keep Marte in right, and just hope that you can position him well and he can cover that ground. We'll see. We'll see where the Mets go from here. Outfield, bullpen, and maybe one more starter. I think that's where we're at this point after the winter meetings. And I'm not sure how the offseason progresses from here. Do things go back to that snail's pace we were in prior to this week? Or does movement that took place at the meetings keep things rolling and we see the Mets make another couple moves over this next week here before we get into the holidays? That's going to be all, though, for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, @FinkelsteinRyan. Follow the show, @LockedOnMets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On MLB, hosted by Paul Francis Sullivan. Locked On MLB is where you want to go. Stay up to date with everything going on in Major League Baseball. Follow Locked On MLB wherever you get podcasts.